Congresswoman, your campaign spent $53,500 on luxury hotels last year, while your median constituent earns $31,000. Kennedy paused, raising his eyes above his reading glasses, letting the sentence rest there like a receipt left on a kitchen table that nobody could ignore. Can you clarify to her why your lodging bill exceeds her entire annual income? The chamber didn't erupt, as outbursts belong to those who still have a defense. AOC reached for her water, but her hand stopped midway before returning empty. That tiny aborted gesture spoke louder than any drafted statement could. It wasn't solely the question that shattered the room. It was the instinct to buy a moment with a sip, followed by the realization that even the glass had turned into evidence. Kennedy didn't smile, lean back, or scan the room for reactions, because men like him require no applause when the data is already performing. He flipped the page as if nothing strange had happened. That was its true brutality. No shouting, no theatrics, no viral jab, just a flat page turn from a man who knew Washington's most destructive noise is paper shifting from one fact to another. He had read for 11 minutes prior to the water glass incident, and he would read for 11 more minutes after it. He had opened the ordinary manila folder at 10:14 a.m. It was the kind of plain item found by the thousands in federal offices, becoming terrifying only when someone begins reciting its contents. Inside lay 41 pages of financial records, transaction logs, FEC filings, bank summaries, and highlighted documents, all ordered chronologically. It's the ultimate foe of politicians who survive by twisting the past into a more favorable narrative. The hearing was ostensibly about campaign finance transparency, which was the first error. AOC had built a national profile by feigning outrage at corruption, assuming nobody would ever scrutinize her own paperwork closely enough to weaponize it. She had delivered a 1-2-minute opening monologue regarding dark money, corporate PACs, institutional rot, and the moral bankruptcy of leaders who treat public trust like a personal credit card. The gallery offered her the polished applause reserved for a performance whose conclusion everyone believes is predetermined. Kennedy sat completely still through all 12 minutes, keeping his hands on his folder and his glasses on his face, looking like a man awaiting a pre-ordered meal. Kennedy didn't thank the Congresswoman for coming, didn't praise her passion, and didn't execute the fake Senate pleasantries that turn conflicts into pillow fights before a real punch lands. He didn't claim to respect her advocacy, admire her voice, or lauded her commitment to reform, because none of that was why he was there. Opening his folder to the first page, he lowered his eyes and uttered the plainest phrase possible. In 2017, the Congresswoman's chief of staff, Saikot Chakrabarti, managed 2 political action committees, Justice Democrats PAC and Brand New Congress PAC. Between 2017 and 2018, those PACs funneled $885,000 to 2 limited liability companies, Brand New Congress LLC and Brand New Campaign LLC. Both entities were controlled by Chakrabarti, and Kennedy stated that connection plainly knowing embellishment would only weaken it. So once funds shift from a PAC into an LLC, public tracking ability vanishes. Kennedy glanced up just long enough to drop the phrase that originally made AOC famous, dark money. Then he returned to the document. He simply read the sequence PAC to LLC, LLC to consulting, consulting to silence with the calm disdain of a man, proving the magic trick was simple once the mechanics were exposed. During this period, the Congresswoman held a board seat on Justice Democrats PAC, the exact machine that funded her rise. It was the same apparatus, wrapped in revolutionary rhetoric while routing capital through channels ordinary donors would never see. Kennedy didn't emphasize the word jail, knowing the term was brutal enough on its own. The Congresswoman's boyfriend, Riley Roberts, had taken $6,000 from Brand New Congress PAC for marketing services, and Kennedy recorded that detail with the same clinical precision used for every other charge. Saikot Chakrabarti later exited her office in 2019, a departure AOC never publicly clarified in a way that would satisfy anyone hearing this money trail. Money entered the front door, wearing the mask of political reform, vanished into LLC shadows, and resurfaced as consulting strategy, services, and paperwork so ambiguous it looked like deliberate camouflage rather than transparency. The politician who made dark money her ultimate villain now sat across from a senator, outlining a structure mirroring the exact practices she had spent years condemning. AOC leaned into her microphone, attempting to interrupt by calling the figures misleading and thoroughly audited. That page turn was colder than an interruption because interrupting at least acknowledges the other person exists. Kennedy treated her objection like ambient noise in a federal building, a hum from the lights, a cough in the gallery present, but not important enough to halt the record. January 2018, he resumed, and the hearing advanced without her permission. In a debate, a politician can pivot, but in an audit, the paper relentlessly keeps coming. Brand New Campaign LLC distributed $127,000 over 14 months to a third entity, Bronx Forward Consulting LLC, allegedly for digital strategy consulting. Bronx Forward was registered in Delaware using a mailbox-only address lacking a public website, a visible client roster, a meaningful portfolio, and any clear staff beyond a registered agent tied to the campaign circle. He did this precisely, like a man treating documents as weapons that shouldn't be left pointing in the wrong direction. 5 pages now rested side by side, edges parallel, forming a frail paper skyline of transfers, entities, and explanations too weak to support themselves. Nobody needed a political science degree to see what this was, as average people easily recognize a shell game, even when the shells say consulting. Sent from Chakrabarty to the Congresswoman, the subject line read, "Structure, keep offline." There are phrases in Washington that sound bad because they are bad, and phrases that sound worse because even guilty people usually know better than to write them down. Kennedy carefully read the body, including guidelines for answering questions about the link between Justice Democrats PAC and Brand New Congress LLC. He slowed down on the final line, not for dramatic effect, but because some sentences must be nailed to the wall, word by word. "We met at an event." He put the page down, letting the room absorb the sentence like dry earth absorbing oil slowly, then permanently. You don't need to be a prosecutor to see why a political operative would tell a congresswoman to fake distance from a man whose PAC LLC and strategic machine had wrapped around her assent. Furthermore, you don't get to spend years lecturing America about corruption and dark money, then feign surprise when someone reads your own keep offline email beneath fluorescent lights. AOC's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. But Kennedy was already on page 7. They were the exact same river. The core issue wasn't whether it was campaign money, PAC money, taxpayer money, donor money, or consulting money. The question was where it went, who controlled the route, who benefited, and who was expected to keep believing the sermon after seeing the receipts. 2025 campaign disbursements. He read the words sounding dull until the attached locations emerged. Hotel Palacio Provincial, San Juan, Puerto Rico. This was followed by the Vidara Hotel and Spa in Las Vegas at $3,500 nightly, and the Leo Kent Hotel in Tucson, a boutique high-rise at $3,100 a night. He didn't rush the names because luxury carries a distinct rhythm when spoken aloud. Next came the restaurants, a tasting menu in New York City, premium seafood on the Vegas Strip, cocktails in San Juan, and a venue rental at the same arena where she attended a Bad Bunny concert, billing it as campaign activity. By the time Kennedy stated the total $53,500 in luxury hotel expenses, the figure no longer sounded like a number. It sounded like a verdict. $53,500 in campaign funds given by donors told they were funding a working-class movement was blown on rooms, upgrades, fine dining, travel, and the polished comforts of the very Kell she claimed to fight. In a district boasting a $31,000 median income, that hotel bill wasn't just excessive, it was truly obscene. It was the kind of obscene needing no profanity, because the decimal point did all the insulting. He was steering the room toward the exact sentence that would soon trap her hand near the glass. Next, he transitioned to the national tour with Senator Sanders. Dubbed Fighting Oligarchy, the tour sounded noble in Washington until someone compared the itinerary to the invoices. Kennedy didn't call it hypocrisy because that word was too small for the evidence he presented. He produced an internal campaign email from March 2025 showing a scheduling coordinator demanding a room upgrade from a travel contact, insisting on nothing below 4-star because she preferred a high thread count. He then placed a second email from the same thread beside it, warning staff not to let anyone photograph the hotel lobby because the chandelier sent the wrong message. They knew the chandelier sent the wrong message, that the room contradicted the rhetoric, and that luxury imagery clashed with their language of struggle. Yet, instead of altering their behavior, they merely tried to hide the visuals. That isn't a staffer's error. 12 pages now covered the desk, telling a story no communications director could mitigate with a statement about fighting for families. Money was flowing exactly where campaign cash shouldn't go, especially when the spender built a career accusing others of selling out the poor. The gallery stayed quiet, not because the facts were entirely unknown, but because hearing them sequentially made them infinitely heavier than scattered headlines. But sequence is ruthless, transforming isolated excuses into an undeniable pattern. Kennedy knew this, which is why he never let the room breathe enough to break the facts into little islands of spin. He read like a man counting charges, not necessarily criminal ones, but moral and political charges against the persona she sold to millions. This wasn't a movement. It was a brand with room service. Then came September 2021, the Met Gala, the $35,000 tickets, and the dress screaming tax the rich, while the actual bill was fought over privately. He picked up a message from the hairstylist agency explaining this was the third time they were promised payment. They noted they were a small business with only 4 employees and couldn't absorb the loss. That is the detail Washington desperately hopes gets buried, because it strips away ideology, leaving only a powerless person waiting for a powerful person to pay their bill. Kennedy placed that page with the rest, aligned it neatly, and suddenly the desk resembled a map of someone else's hypocrisy. PAC to LLC to consulting, campaign cash to luxury hotel to chandelier, chandelier to thread count, gala to designer gown, gown to unpaid vendors, all operating under the banner of justice. He removed his glasses, slowly cleaning them with a handkerchief. He then summarized the money trail without raising his voice because the factual summary was more brutal than any insult. The funds had moved from political donations into shadows, from shadows to insiders, from donors to luxury, and from slogans into invoices the working class was never meant to see. Out in the hallway, AOC's communications director was on the phone. Then she asked a quiet, practical question. How much of this was in FEC records? The pause before the answer was far too long. That was the ultimate nightmare because a scandal built on public records is much harder to brush off than one built on leaks. You can't blame hackers, rivals, anonymous sources, or deceptive editing when the receipts sit in government filings with dates, numbers, vendors, and signatures. Back at the desk, AOC's pen had stopped moving right after the Chakrabarti email. Her briefing papers, color-coded, tabbed, and prepared by a staff of 11, sat untouched to her right, a monument to the hearing she thought she was attending. Not one page was turned, and no prepared defense found its moment, because no binder can save a politician from a folder she didn't realize the opposition had organized better. In the gallery, a woman with a tax the rich tote bag shifted, consciously pulling her hand away from it. She simply withdrew her touch as if the slogan had suddenly grown uncomfortably hot. Kennedy closed one tab and opened another, showing the room that 3 tabs still remained. That visible thickness became its own form of dread, allowing onlookers to measure the impending damage with their eyes. The physical reality that despite everything already read, a mountain of paper remained. Kennedy's voice shifted slightly when he announced he wanted to discuss words. It wasn't louder or harsher, but warmer and almost conversational, making it significantly more dangerous. But this warmth carried immense weight. It was the warmth that precedes a man explaining why facts actually matter. He acknowledged her gift for language, and the room immediately knew the compliment offered no escape. This setup only sounded generous if you didn't understand Kennedy's tactics. He wasn't flattering her. He was measuring the massive size of her microphone before calculating the cost of using it recklessly. March 2019. He read the Congresswoman claimed CARE was founded after 9/1, even though it was established in 1994, 7 years prior. Kennedy refused to treat this as a harmless slip. because errors that serve a political narrative are rarely scrutinized as heavily as they should be. February 2019, she called the Amazon HQ2 incentive package a $3 billion giveaway. "You cannot give away money that doesn't exist yet," Kennedy essentially stated, "but you certainly can lose 25,000 jobs," which nearly happened. That line hit hard, linking her absolute certainty to the severe material consequences that followed. Kennedy slowed his pace, recognizing some words are too heavy to casually toss into partisan battles. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum had asked public figures to stop using Holocaust terminology for political comparisons. The Auschwitz Memorial made a similar plea, and Jewish leaders and survivors condemned her language. They were institutions and people whose moral authority stemmed from memory, history, suffering, and the dead. Kennedy looked up just long enough to emphasize that when the people carrying the weight of those words ask you to stop, continuing is an active choice, not ignorance. Then came the February 2026 Munich Security Conference, and Kennedy's voice remained flat. Kennedy didn't pretend the word was minor, knowing it's one of the heaviest terms in human law and memory. Danny Orbach, a military historian at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who co-authored a peer-reviewed study analyzing the conflict, responded that the genocide accusation was factually and legally false. Under the Genocide Convention, Kennedy explained, the term requires proof of special intent to destroy a protected group, concentration camps, genocide, never again, dark money, giveaways. She treated all of them as usable political tools. They were dramatic labels slapped over complex realities whenever she needed moral thunder. His point was sharper and uglier. The problem wasn't her passion, but her absolute certainty without factual custody. She wielded words with a prosecutor's force and a protest sign's accuracy, expecting everyone to accept her emotion instead of evidence. He shifted to the final quote in that section, December 2024. Asked about $4,550 in taxpayer-funded payments to a dance company and Juan D. Gonzalez for training in the House Disbursements Report. Her social media response had been fiercely emphatic, not cautious, not curious, and unwilling to verify before swinging back. Kennedy looked at her and made the correction brutally plain. It was not an FEC filing. It was a House Disbursements Report, meaning they were absolutely taxpayer funds, not campaign cash. A congresswoman who can't distinguish between campaign money and taxpayer money shouldn't lecture the nation on campaign finance as if everyone else is corrupt while she remains pure. If she actually could distinguish between them, the problem wasn't ignorance, but something far worse. Kennedy didn't have to pick between the two scenarios because either one demolished the brand she spent years building. He stated the line landed with the blunt ugliness of a closing door. 5 statements, 5 facts, all completely wrong, delivered with absolute certainty to millions who trusted her precision. Kennedy placed both hands flat on the folder, where he came from. He noted there was a difference between being wrong and being wrong loud. Everyone gets things wrong, he admitted, citing the harmless human error of misjudging the weather and leaving an umbrella in the car. But there was another kind of wrong, the kind equipped with a microphone, a massive following, and a talent for picking the most inflammatory word before checking its truth. Genocide, concentration camp, $3 billion giveaway, founded after 9/1 taxpayer money FEC filing. Careless people hedge, Kennedy implied. Careless people say maybe, I think, or let me verify. But the Congresswoman rarely sounded uncertain about anything, and the unbroken sameness of that certainty was the true danger. When a politician sounds identical, speaking truth and error, the audience loses the ability to tell them apart. AOC leaned forward, and for the first time since the financial segment began, her voice carried the sharp edge of someone finding an escape route. It was the classic escape tactic. Avoid the answer and relocate the argument. She pivoted from her record to his party, from the specific receipt to a broad tribal conflict she could hide inside. He simply waited with folded hands, watching her throw a rope across a river he refused to cross. When she finished, the sentence hung in the air, deploying all the standard machinery of modern politics. Change the subject, make the questioner the issue, widen the frame, pull the audience into a team conflict, and hope nobody remembers the original line item. But Kennedy wasn't playing that game, and he didn't move an inch toward the bait. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, "we're not discussing my party. We're discussing your words, specifically the ones that were wrong." It failed not because Kennedy shouted it down, but because he completely refused to follow it. He stayed glued to the paper, the quote, the record, and the line in front of him, making his refusal the ultimate attack. He successfully avoided the massive fog machines of ideology, party grievances, slogans, and media narratives politicians use when things get too clear. And every time she tried to broaden the conversation beyond his folder, he politely declined. It was the quietest form of political dominance, having the discipline to deny your opponent a new battlefield. AOC's hands were flat on the desk again, but now they looked forcefully pressed down rather than casually placed. In the gallery, a Democratic committee member stared intently at his water glass without drinking, realizing it was safer than looking at either side of the table. The room had reached the point where silence was no longer neutral. It was a binding vote people tried not to cast with their faces. The soft noise of paper settling against paper drifted through the room like punctuation, ending a painfully long sentence. 22 minutes of continuous reading led to that sound, and closing the folder told everyone the evidence phase was officially over. He nudged it aside and rested his hands on the clean wood, a bare patch of table following a storm of documents. He was finished talking to the room and started addressing the nation, watching from phones, cramped apartments, break rooms, laundromats, and bus stops. "I want to talk about the 14th District," he announced, steering the hearing into its most perilous phase. The topic was no longer just money or reckless language. Consequence is what heavily branded politicians fear most because it leaves the studio and goes home with people who can't afford empty symbolism. Kennedy cited the nonpartisan Center for Effective Lawmaking at Vanderbilt and UVA, noting the Congresswoman ranked 230th out of 240 Democrats in legislative effectiveness. She introduced 21 bills in her first Congress. Among all 19 New York legislators, she ranked dead last. He didn't linger on the numbers as if the ranking was the main point. The ranking was merely the doorway to the real accusation. She tweeted constantly, gave fiery speeches, built a massive brand, attended the Met Gala, flew to Munich, dominated stages, turned phrases into merchandise, and monetized outrage. But she totally failed to convert her constituents' problems into forceful legislation. In Congress, where speeches are cheap and cameras are everywhere, passing legislation remains the actual job. The room instantly knew this wasn't about abstract effectiveness rankings anymore. Amazon had promised 25,000 jobs, $150,000 average salaries, $65,000 entry-level roles, billions in projected wages, and a massive economic boost, exactly where AOC claimed to defend. She aggressively led the campaign that killed the deal, called the defeat a monumental victory, and paraded the collapse like a moral trophy. His argument was that working people can't cash slogans, feed kids with ideological purity, or pay rent using the applause of wealthy activists. He noted that 57% of voters in her own district explicitly said the loss was bad for New York. That mattered because they weren't Republican consultants in a green room. They were the residents whose names filled her speeches, but whose opinions became inconvenient when they contradicted the brand. A Times Square billboard had broadcasted, "Thanks for nothing, AOC," staying up long enough to permanently cement the insult into the city's consciousness. A congresswoman proudly declared victory while thousands of potential jobs completely vanished, telling the desperate people who needed them to clap for an abstract principle instead. Kennedy's expression barely changed as he described this, knowing the arrogance of that moment required no extra performative heat. The smaller office was a pathetic 6% of the original promise, an insignificant fraction dressed up as vindication by politicians, hoping nobody remembered the original massive number. The original deal promised a generational scale of opportunity the smaller office never pretended to match. Then he introduced Maria Gutierrez into the record, dragging the hearing into a heartbreaking segment that couldn't be dismissed as paperwork. Maria was a single mother in Queens, raising 2 children, Sophia and Miguel, by cleaning Manhattan offices. Kennedy's voice stayed perfectly steady, intimately understanding that ordinary, grinding details become devastating when placed directly beside campaign luxury. One desperate woman, 2 kids, 2 buses, 1 train, one meager salary, one cramped apartment, and a single refrigerator. That wasn't manufactured melodrama. In 2018, Maria applied for an entry-level customer service training program tied to Amazon's planned headquarters that could have paid $65,000 annually. That figure would have instantly more than doubled her income, not in theory, not in an academic white paper, but in the daily arithmetic of rent, groceries, school clothes, Metro cards, and unpaid bills. She received a preliminary offer, printed the letter, and taped it proudly to her refrigerator. Then the deal died, the letter came down, and the refrigerator stopped being a promise. Kennedy completely refused to milk the painful image, knowing he didn't need to manipulate the emotion. He pushed forward because Maria's pain wasn't a fleeting cinematic scene. 3 excruciating years later, she was still cleaning offices, still taking 2 buses and a train, and still trapped inside the exact grim numbers politicians casually convert into empty slogans for unearned moral authority. Sophia was 14, doing well in high school, and sacrificing weekends to work at a grocery store just to help with rent. Maria recently applied for a grueling Bronx distribution center job offering $38,000, but didn't get it because 200 desperate applicants fought over 12 spots. The lost, lucrative position offered $65,000. The currently available grueling job offered only $38,000. The staggering $27,000 difference wasn't a trivial accounting footnote. It was the brutal difference between Sophia peacefully finishing high school with her friends and abruptly starting over because rent had beaten the family again. It meant the difference between a mother coming home completely exhausted and a mother coming home with a sliver of financial margin. Kennedy let that crushing figure sit in the room as basic family math, rejecting it as sterile policy math. The Congresswoman aggressively spent $53,500 on elite luxury hotels last year, while Maria ground out a brutal existence on exactly $31,000. The hotel bill perfectly eclipsed Maria's entire annual income, plus an additional $22,500. And no amount of revolutionary language could make that staggering comparison look less grotesque. Specifically, it was Maria's relentless arithmetic, the terrifying math of a desperate woman counting every dollar, because every dollar decides if her apartment survives another month. Kennedy carefully straightened his tie and replaced his glasses, a subtle gesture radiating absolute finality. The campaign cash had explicitly gone to the wrong places, and the struggling people of the 14th District were still tragically trapped on the morning bus. 2 buses and a subway train every morning. The exact same grueling route, the same stagnant salary, and the same barren refrigerator with absolutely nothing hanging where the bright future used to reside. A slick, well-funded congresswoman could easily build a highly lucrative national brand, claiming to fight for vulnerable people like Maria. But tragically, Maria herself couldn't afford to live inside the reality of that brand. Kennedy gave a sharp nod to the committee chair and simply stated, "I yield my time." He calmly reached for his water glass, took a measured sip, set it back down, and meticulously aligned it perfectly with the table's edge. The hearing was officially over for him, not because every damning page had been read, but because more than enough was read to render the remaining pages completely unnecessary. The manila folder actually still contained 18 unread pages sitting silently like unfired rounds of ammunition. That represented the ultimate lingering cruelty. AOC stood up extremely slowly, totally lacking the confident, camera-ready dominance of someone who owned the room. She used the stiff, hyper-careful movements of a person, acutely aware that every camera was now intensely studying her body for signs of visible damage. She didn't deliver a closing statement, completely abandoned the sharp clapback her communications team frantically prepared, and utterly failed to mention dark money, billionaires, oligarchy, or the working people of the Bronx. At the door, she hesitated briefly and rotated halfway back toward the desk, gazing at where her pen still rested at its awkward, abandoned angle. Her mouth parted slightly for half a second, and then she definitively chose absolute silence. arguably her first strategically sound answer all morning. The heavy wooden doors completely closed, providing the absolute final audio clip the C-SPAN broadcast required. Within a mere 24 hours, the Federal Election Commission officially announced an aggressively expanded review of the transfer chain linking Brand New Congress LLC and Bronx Forward Consulting LLC. Simultaneously, AOC's office quickly released a vague statement dismissing the devastating hearing as pure partisan performance art. Predictably, the incredibly vague statement failed to address the $27,000 funneled to Bronx Forward, ignored the damning Chakrabarty email, bypassed the staggering luxury hotel total, and wholly neglected the small vendor still helplessly waiting on payment. The agonizing phrase, "2 buses and a train," relentlessly dominated digital trending charts for 19 hours, primarily because the country easily digested that visceral, painful imagery vastly faster than any complex LLC diagram. Someone printed the exact quote onto a poster and boldly taped it to the front door of AOC's district office in the Bronx, positioning it squarely beneath the official congressional seal and beside a community health clinic flyer. A clear photograph of that brutal poster rapidly spread across social media platforms. Major elite donors instantly began to hesitate, not because they suddenly morphed into moral philosophers, but strictly because elite donors process financial risk significantly faster than abstract political principles. Kennedy had successfully mutated AOC into a completely radioactive risk simply by subjecting her to the exact ordeal she rarely faced on camera, a complete, uninterrupted, and totally unanswered forensic audit. While that plunge wasn't enough to permanently end her career immediately, it was absolutely enough to make every single paid strategist in her orbit violently stop sleeping comfortably. 9 points eroding in that deeply entrenched district didn't guarantee total collapse, but it definitively confirmed the protective edges were rapidly fraying. It successfully signaled to the next ambitious primary challenger that a viable doorway existed exactly where an impenetrable wall once stood. Barely within a month, the Department of Justice officially launched a preliminary inquiry deeply scrutinizing the controversial PAC to LLC transfer structure, resulting in Chakrabarty immediately receiving a federal subpoena. He promptly retained high-powered legal counsel and totally ceased posting on social media, an extreme maneuver which in Washington operates as its very own unique language of crisis. AOC subsequently completely canceled 3 highly anticipated television appearances with her scrambling office, incredibly labeling them mere scheduling adjustments, knowing no political office ever openly admits it is hiding from media oxygen. It was the specific small physical movement millions of viewers now completely recognized. His ensuing answer completely lacked the aggressive gloating of a victory lap, contained absolutely zero humorous punchlines, and avoided any rehearsed campaign slogans. "I sincerely hope Maria gets the absolute next job," he stated calmly. That restrained pivot was arguably the single most damaging tactical move he could have possibly deployed, simply because he completely refused to make himself the central story immediately after successfully proving she had actively made herself the core problem. Deep inside a cramped one-bedroom apartment situated in Queens, Maria Gutierrez remained sitting at the kitchen table with the harsh overhead lights blazing and her mobile phone placed entirely face down. Sophia relentlessly worked on her 9th grade biology assignment at the opposite end of the table, studying cellular division with a pencil worn entirely too short, all while the massive refrigerator loudly hummed behind them. It sat there functioning exactly like the painful ghost of a permanently stolen future, carefully peeled away alongside pieces of old tape. Sophia slowly looked up from her homework and casually mentioned that the old man with the accent appeared on television again. Maria typically never consumed congressional hearings, but several people had texted her viral clips, and for exactly one fleeting day, at least, someone prominent had finally said out loud exactly what her brutal life genuinely cost. Maria locked her tired eyes directly onto the blank refrigerator door instead of looking down at her silenced phone. "Yes," she confirmed softly. "He absolutely did." She didn't mention that an old senator wielding a manila folder absolutely does not function as a valid job application, that a viral hashtag totally fails to pay the monthly rent, and that 2 crowded buses and a subway train would absolutely still be brutally waiting exactly at 4:47 the following morning. Yet someone had finally placed her modest salary beside a luxury hotel bill inside a room full of cameras, and the woman claiming to fight for her had provided no answer. On that day in that kitchen with the refrigerator humming and queens moving outside the window, a line had been drawn that no narrative could erase.